She pressed her forehead to his. Palms splayed at the hollow of his throat as if she could steady the wild beating beneath his ribs. And when Tomas tried to pull away, she tightened her grip until his breath hitched and tore like glass. The moon painted her cheekbones silver, a smear of white that made the scar running from temple to jaw look like a stripe of lit metal. Her voice was a rasp he felt in his teeth. "Give me a child," she whispered, and the words landed between them like a verdict. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. He heard the sentence as if through water. It did not belong to the woman everyone in the alleys called the Alpha, the woman who moved like a shadow, with a jaw like a block of granite, and a reputation that closed doors and opened coffins. Reina Moretti's name could stop a man in the street. Policemen leaned away from it, and rivals counted her as the threat that kept them awake. She was Moretti Iron and Moonscar, the enforcer whose teeth had sealed more than one enemy's fate. She did not ask for lineage, she claimed it, demanded it, was bred to value heirs like property. Tomas tasted dirt and rosemary. His hands, calloused from pulling weeds and lifting crates in dawn light, still smelled of the small plot he rented on the ragged edge of the city. His mother had taught him to tend the earth like a prayer. He had learned to keep his head down as gangs swallowed whole neighborhoods and children disappeared into pockets of violence. He had learned to be quiet and useful and invisible, until the night he saw a body in an alley with eyes like the moon. The late neighbor who trusted him with a tip that became a punishment. "You're shaking," she said. The pronouncement was not cruel. Whatever armor she wore, leather, chain, the bones of 100 fights, slipped around her voice and showed bare, trembling skin. "Are you going to say no, Tomas Costa? Are you going to give me a reason to walk away?" He had names, a list of debts settled with favors, threats slid across tables. But he did not have the capacity to refuse the plea and the threat braided into the same breath. Reina's offer was simple in the world's merciless arithmetic. Shelter for a man who had watched a powerful capo fall. A shadow of safety cast by the Moretti name. In return, she wanted legacy, a child of her blood or his, enough to cement Moretti dominance through a future that would carry her line. The bargain was a cruelty wrapped in protection, and yet he had felt, in the brief loosening of her jaw, the bones behind the mask. There had been a softness, a private hunger that frightened her, and it was this that made him consider the impossible. They stood under the full moon in the courtyard behind the coupe, had fixed for her lieutenant the month prior. Tomas's hands had raised nails against a world that never spared him notice, and the city was a half-remembered roar beyond the brick walls. Reina's men were not far. Power was a scent in the air. Tomas, who was used to the slow hours of planting and the sudden tremor of storms, felt the world tilt like a cart being unloaded. He was small. He was nothing to them. Yet he was the only living witness to the kind of truth that made the empire of Moretti tremble, and that knowledge had a gravity that made him an asset worth bargaining for. She let go, finally, not with the cold of someone who'd always been in control, but with the sudden shiver of someone who had dared to ask for something private and been exposed. Her hand fell to her side, fingernails white in the moonlight. "We have 2 nights," she said, 2 nights to say whether you'll take the protection. After that, my patience is not a currency I will keep spending." Tomas thought of his mother's tuberous hands, the way she hummed as she peeled the skin off potatoes, the stubborn hope in the rows of beans she coaxed from the soil. He thought of staying alive in a city that had no mercy for the witnesses of men who dealt in death. He saw the silhouette of the traitor he had seen that winter, a man in a cheap cop's jacket ducking into the warehouse where the Morettis had made a show of rearranging the city's fear. That man's face spun in his memory like a weather vane, and with every turn it hit the same point. If the Morettis decided the man had betrayed them, Tomas might be the rope that cut him down. If the Morettis decided he was expendable, Tomas could be erased and the truth would die. "You think you can shield me with a name," Tomas said finally, voice low and rough. "You think that makes my life yours to barter?" "It does," Reyna answered. She did not sound pleased with the statement, only certain. "And you will not be the first to be offered safety in exchange for a child's future. The Morettis do not disregard blood. We are less forgiving of heirs lost to weakness." Her words were a doctrine, a history pressing down on her shoulders, as if the family name was a mantle made of iron. He had read the city in the faces of men who crossed her. Respect curdled into fear. Love foundered into obedience. The Moretti's code had raised and broken people in equal measure. Reyna, who had been shaped by that code, stood before him and asked for a deviation so radical it felt like treason. A request for an intimate, permanent tie that would make him both property and sanctuary. Beneath the surface of the deal glinted everything that terrified him more than Moretti wrath. Being turned into an ornament, a bearer of lineage that would cage him in a story he had not written. Tomas wanted simple things. Enough food to keep his mother set for one more winter, a roof that did not leak, the time to coax another seed from the dirt. He had no taste for dynasties, no patience for demands that a life be mortgaged to guarantee a family's iron grip. He almost laughed. It would have punctured the silence like a cracked bottle. Instead, he swallowed and thought of the corpse he'd seen, the coppery smell of blood on a winter wind, the way the city had closed ranks like an animal around the ones who stumbled. The man had been a small-time dealer who'd talked too much. He'd been punished with a violence that was surgical. Tomas had been there by accident and had not spoken up because fear had a thicker glove than his own moral clarity. Watching the corpse had been a silently corrosive thing on his conscience. He had not intended to become a key in a family's lock, but here he was. Reyna's eyes were a strange, dark light. Up close, they were not merely predatory. They were old and tired and very human. There was the faintest shimmer, a film of sorrow, and for the first time he saw the woman the stories hid, someone who had held children in the winter when Moretti bloodlines needed to be preserved, someone who had watched sons and daughters be made into heirs and martyrs. She had clung to duty until it turned her bones to steel. Now she asked something that would weaken that armor by introducing a tender risk, something the family both needed and feared. "Why me?" Tomas asked. The simpleness of it made Reyna blink. "Because you are a witness who has not sold your silence," she said. "Because you plead differently than a man who has been broken by the city's hungry teeth. Because your hands remember another life and it humbles you. And because I know the face of the traitor you saw." Her certainty was another kind of threat. He had not told anyone. For reasons his conscience could not fully explain, that unlauded fact made something inside him flare thin and sharp. "You know everything," he said. He felt naked, and the words made his chest unclench a degree he hadn't expected, not because knowledge was comfort, but because a secret shared became something they could negotiate. Reyna's mouth tightened. "Your silence keeps the head used to close the city for another night. My protection keeps you alive while the Morettis decide where the blade should fall. If you take the bargain, I will sign you into the ledger. You live under Moretti's shadow. Nobody touches you without my sanction. If you refuse—" "If I refuse," Tomas finished, "they'll come for me anyway." Her nod was small, almost pitying. Then you must choose what kind of death you'll accept, a quiet one by men who do not care for legacy, or a life bound to a name that will force you to become something you may hate. The sound of his name in her mouth folded him. He had always been the shy tenant on the edge of things. The city had never intended to look twice at him. Now the Alpha who could command bodies to break at a thought regarded him as both shield and seed. It was obscene and intimate in the same breath. The bargain came with an equality he did not want. To keep his life, to keep his mother safe, he might have to live a life that would make his hands forget the soil and learn instead to cradle a child that bore an emblem his heart could not reconcile. The courtyard hummed with the distant notes of the city, washing lines clacking, the late-night men with their truck engines, the thud of a closing bar door. Somewhere farther off, a siren coughed itself to sleep. Under the bone-full moon, the city was a beast exhaled. Tomas felt the ridiculousness of feeling small and huge in the same moment. He was afraid for reasons that had nothing to do with Reina's reach. He was afraid for integrity, for the erosion of the man his mother had raised. He was also afraid in the way that made a man take tiny steps toward survival. He placed his hand against the place where her palm had pressed his throat. The scar along her jaw lay like a promise he'd not yet earned. 2 nights, he said. I will think. She watched him the way an animal assesses the balance of a trap, then stepped back into the shadows where her silhouette became a pausing question. Her men stood beyond the wall, phantoms in coats, and the city's alleys knit themselves shut behind his small life. He was left holding the moonlight and the terrible luminous plea she'd made. That night, the earth beneath his little plot felt like a ledger of what he'd lost and what might be bartered. He sat on the cracked stoop by dawn, thumbed the frayed edge of a photograph of his mother at 19, and realized the bargain had already begun to rewrite him. The city around him, its cops, its rival families, the whispered sentences that could sentence a man to silence, loomed nearer. He had 2 nights. The sun would weight his decision with its plain light. Under the next moon, Reina would come to collect an answer. In the meantime, the traitor he had seen moved within the city's belly, and each breath the man took tightened the noose around Thomas's future. The first choice had been made the moment the Alpha asked for a child. The rest, he thought, would be the slow unpicking of the man he'd been and the forging of the one he would have to become. Tomas woke before the sun, as he always did, to the soft, habitual work of hands. He moved without thought. Dirt under nails, the scrape of a hoe, the small mechanical blessing of coaxing life from the earth. The garden smelled of wet green and old wood. His mother slept on, her breath a slow drum. For a handful of hours, the city did not exist. There was only furrow and seed and the steady geometry of rows. It was the one place he could not be used as leverage because nothing and no one but the soil demanded anything of him. Yet the bargain Reina had pushed into the moonlit courtyard sat in his mouth like metal. He caught himself running a thumb over the scar where her fingers had pressed his throat, feeling the memory of her warmth and the power in the grip that could, if she chose, unravel him. He tried to separate the man who tilled from the man who had seen a corpse with moonlit eyes and stayed silent. The separation felt less possible every hour. He carried the photograph of his mother in his pocket like contraband. She had given him life and lessons that amounted to a kind of stubborn quiet. Don't ask for things you don't need. Feed your neighbors when you can. Never, ever trust the sound of a man's smooth voice at night. If she learned he was bargaining his body for safety, she would not understand. If she learned he'd spoken with Reina Moretti at all, she might die from the shock of it. Protecting her became the prism through which every option bent. He used the first day to pretend nothing had shifted. When the sun was high and the city yawed into its heat, a courier came by with a sealed note. Black wax, Reina's sigil pressed into it, A moon having a dagger. His fingers trembled with the weight of the paper. The note read, "2 nights, meet me at dusk. Bring the seed of your answer. No one else attends." It was not a demand, it was an edict, which was worse. He folded the paper gently and slid it back into his pocket. The world kept moving, vendors shouting, a child with a balloon, the laugh of men playing cards on stoops. The city could keep pretending it was ordinary while men moved in darkness. When dusk fell, he carried a pot of stew, an offering of something he'd made, to place some human measure on an arrangement that felt like a sentence. Reyna met him at the gate to the courtyard, not with the armor of myth, but with a plain dark coat cinched at the waist and the look of a woman who had wrestled with sleepless nights. The moon had not yet risen, and her eyes were black hollows. She accepted the pot with a small, almost civil nod. She had already settled terms with an efficiency that made him uneasy. She produced a ledger the size of a small book. Inside were names and notations written in a hand that was both precise and indifferent. "You will be registered under a protectorate," she said without preamble. "You will be housed with people who keep to themselves. You will be seen only as Tomas Costa, tenant and smallholder. You leave the city only with sanction. You will not speak of Moretti dealings. You will not associate with known enemies of the family." "What's in it for me, besides non-death?" he asked, and the voice that came out was too brittle still. "Your mother will be moved to a safe location, supplied. You will have an allowance. You will be given medical access if needed. You will be taught what is necessary, how to read threats, how to conceal a child, how Moretti heirs are hidden until they are ready. You will be kept alive." It was a list of mercies wrapped in commands. She spoke like a woman trained to compress tenderness into logistics. It felt to him both generous and suffocating. He wanted to ask for more. What about choice? What about leaving? But the ledger's black ink seemed to reach into him and write its own margins. "Who will watch me?" he asked finally. Reyna's mouth softened, the steel backgrounded by something that could have been warmth. "I will," she said, "though I will not be there every moment. My tenentes will keep you. One of them, enforcer and old hand, will be assigned to your compound. He will be harsh in means when necessary, but learned in silence." "You think I will be happy with that?" Tomas said, and a laugh that escaped him was rusty with disbelief. "I don't want to be taught to hide. I want to wake to the smell of the earth." "You will not be forced to become what you hate," Reyna answered. "But the family will not allow a child to grow near the places the city calls home. We hide them so that the world that kills our name cannot find our blood. I have witnessed people I cared about taken and used as bargaining chips. I will not let that happen if I can prevent it." The door of negotiation had an edge to it. The more he probed the ledger, the more the world pushed back. He wanted assurances he could not ask for. He wanted a guarantee that accepting would not mean surrendering his conscience. Reyna, for her part, wanted a child, and that asked Tomas to become part of a lineage that had perpetrated the city's cruelties. They spent the next hours talking in a slow suture of cautious curiosity. He told her, small things at first, of how he planted beans in staggered rows because it made better use of a small plot, of the way he and his mother traded soup recipes with the neighbor across the alley. He kept the big thing inside, the face of the man in the cheap cop's jacket. Reyna answered with fragments of her past, a brother worn down by expectation, an aunt who died young because the family had no use for weakness. The way her father's voice had had a cruelty that made her throat close. When his hands fidgeted and his sentences broke, she would pick up his wrist and, with a gentleness that belied her reputation, flatten his knuckle with her thumb. "You keep talking," she would say. "It tells me you are human." And there, in the small interstices, something tender and dangerous began to loosen. Tomas found himself noticing the small lines at the corners of her eyes, the way she chewed the inside of her cheek when listening, the precarious softness of her jaw when she looked at him as if he were an animal about to bolt into danger. Reyna, too, found her own armor wear down. She let him watch her bathe at the ford one afternoon, the moonlight catching on water, and she did not hide the way her shoulder bore the scar, or the way her voice trembled when she hummed, a low tune the Morettis had used to lull infants. Those moments were unsanctioned intimacies, and both of them kept stealing them. Yet every stolen breath came with a cost. The city smelled of rain and old violence. It was not long before their fragile closeness scraped against the teeth of the world. On the third night, before the 2 nights Reyna had given him were up, Tomas found the courtyard quieter than usual. One of the tenentes, a thin man named Vasco, who had shadowed him since his first meeting with Reyna, waved him into a small room and closed the door. The lamplight painted Vasco's face in hard ochre. He was a man who had learned to read loyalty like a ledger. "You are being watched," Vasco said without preface. "Not by Fiore or Caponen's men, the obvious ones. This one's quieter." "Who?" Tomas demanded. "A deputy. Corrupt. He moves like a rat who has learned not to fear cats. He was at the docks 3 nights ago, asking about you. He met with a low-level broker who took a call from a warehouse they call Lima 9. That warehouse is Moretti property, officially abandoned, unofficially used. The deputy has been keeping tabs because someone told him there was a witness to a job. You have his interest." Tomas felt his heart run a frantic, animal rhythm against his ribs. "Why would a cop care about me? I'm nothing." "Because you are the kind of nothing that becomes something very useful," Vasco said. "Witnesses make implicits, favors, payoffs, disappearances. If he corners you, he could take you, either to sell your silence or to sell you out. So we give him what he wants? No." Vasco's jaw worked. "If you give him what he wants, you die. You need to be kept away. Reyna has arranged for relocation to a safe house. We can do it tonight." The words had a sharpness that tore out the rest of his illusions. He looked at the pot of stew he had brought as an offering to a bargain that was not yet closed, and realized he was now an object with malleable edges in a war between men who used people as currency. Tomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet again, and the memory of the corpse under the winter moon rose like a tide. Hiding felt like surrender. Surrender felt like life. He hated the trade-off in a way that left his teeth aching. That night, as the safe house door closed behind him, the streets whispered. Vasco took him by the arm with an efficient, practiced gesture and led him along alleys that seemed unfamiliar now. He moved like a man carrying a map that only he could read. The safe house was not grand. It was sensible, a courtyard with a well-guarded gate and other faces like his, people who had been promised reprieve under the Moretti umbrella. There was a toddler who kept pawing at his own ears, a woman with a bruise on her temple who pretended to knit, a young man who bled quiet songs into a guitar. They spoke coded phrases. They did not ask where you had been or why you had come. Reyna met them at the threshold as if she had been expected, stranger but familiar. She took Tomas's hand in public, a small act of possession and protection both. Her fingers were warm, and he felt the world focus in on that line of touch. They ate a meal together with other refugees from the city's more visible cruelties, and Reyna watched him with an intensity that was painful to bear. There was a look in her face that suggested she was tallying accidents and assigning blame for each thing she could not control. Late that night, while the safe house slept, Tomas slipped out to sit in the small courtyard and breathe the cold air. A child cried softly somewhere. The city was a distant, groaning animal beyond the walls. Reyna joined him without announcing herself, and for a long time they just sat, two shapes bound by a silence that hummed with danger. "You did not answer the ledger terms," she said finally. He laughed once, a short, incredulous sound. "I am not certain any ledger can contain me." "Perhaps," she allowed, "but if you refuse to be listed, you're a liability, and liabilities have a way of leaving blood on the hands of anyone who shelters them." He swallowed. "I hate that this is the world. I hate that my choices are safety or a slow theft of everything I am. I hate that I'm weighing my mother's life against my own sense of worth." "You are not the first to choose," Reyna said. "You will not be the last. But if it helps—" She stopped, a hesitation like a crack in a dam. "If it helps, I will tell you one thing now. I have not asked for many things in my life that were mine to claim. I have asked this because—" her voice tightened, "because I am afraid of not leaving something behind. Because the family asks for heirs, and I have been hollowed by it. Because I have never been allowed to make room for a softness that might undo me." Hearing her admit fear unraveled something in him. It was obscene that the greatest predator in the city's mythscape could betray such an obvious hunger for something human. "Do you think a child will fix it?" he asked. "No," she said. "I think a child will complicate it, but perhaps in that complication there is salvage." The word salvage hung between them like a riven prophecy. For the first time, he saw the bargaining not only as a transaction, but as a plea, a woman asking to be human in spite of the demands that had forged her. He slept poorly that night, dreaming of his mother's hands, soft, warm, always busy. He dreamed of the face of the man in the cheap cop jacket and of the ledger that would claim his future. When morning came, he found Reyna already awake, waiting by the window. She had left a small wrapped loaf on the table and a note, "Keep this for when you are hungry." It was a small mercy. The hand that had placed it was enormous and dangerous, but the act itself was human and therefore scandalous. The days that followed were an uneasy, tentative, choreographed intimacy. Reyna taught him to hold his head tall in a city that measured people by what they could be used for. Tomas learned to read the small signs that meant a foot patrol would come by his street, the sentences that meant a bribe had been laid, a favor called in. He learned, too, that Reyna could be both merciless and almost absurdly tender, cradling a sleeping refugee like she might crack if handled poorly. They argued over the ledger's terms, Tomas demanding that his mother not be uprooted farther than necessary, Reyna insisting that distance would mean survival. Their progress was fragile and the world was impatient. On a rain-lashed evening, a message arrived that expanded the danger like a stain. A courier smeared with mud slid a note under the safe-house gate and left before anyone could fetch him. Vasco opened it with a flat hand and passed it to Reyna. She read the words and did not flinch. Her face in the lamplight lost color. "It's from Capone." She folded the paper and tucked it into her coat. "They know where the witness is sheltered. They propose a meeting to discuss terms." Tomas felt the ground tilt again. Meeting. The word was as soft as a lullaby and as sharp as a blade. "If they think they can bargain with me—" "They intend to use you as leverage," Reyna said. "They will demand the ledger's removal, the nullification of what you are to my family. If you go to them and speak, you may save this moment, but you may also doom your mother. If we do not go, Capone will test the walls." The air in the room congealed into threat. They had been skirting around each other with words and small mercies. and now the city's great gears had moved a hand across the chessboard. Tomas' hands shook. He could see the ledger in his head, the way it would look when they wrote his name and drew a line through it if he failed to keep his mouth shut. He could see his mother, a figure in the doorway of their little apartment, looking up when the wrong men came calling. He could imagine Reyna in the alleys, hand on a gun, jaw set like a blade. He could also imagine himself leaving the ledger blank, walking into Capone's men with nothing to say, a man fired out of a cannon and left to spin. Reyna placed a hand on his shoulder, an act that belonged to both protection and claim. "You will not go to them alone," she said. "We will go together, and we will speak as necessary. We will offer a trade. But if Capone pushes for blood instead of bargaining, we break them. I have no use left for men who pretend to be courteous when their gloves are red." Her certainty was a stratagem. It also sounded like a promise. Tomas nodded, not because he agreed completely, but because his life had been reduced to a series of nods and small acquiescences since the moon had thrown Reyna's shadow over his path. He understood now the calculus. To survive in a city that measured worth in heirs and obedience, one sometimes had to step into alliances that ate at the edges of one's soul. He did not know if he could live with the imprint, but he also could not leave his mother to the teeth of men who would treat her as leverage. The next day they left together. Reyna brought a small retinue, men who were quieter than wolves and moved like the memory of thunder. Tomas walked beside her, his heart a small, stubborn thing beneath his ribs. He had accepted the ledger's first inkling of detention, not because the Moretti's name pure and clean had appealed to him, but because the only other choice tasted like erasure. As they threaded through the city toward Capone's meeting place, a dilapidated club with flaking signs and a neon face that sputtered like a dying thing, Tomas felt the city's eyes on him. He felt the pressure of 1,000 possible futures collapsing toward one corridor of decision. Reyna's hand on his back was a constant low drum. He could feel her strength as both shield and spur. They entered the club and were met by the humidity of sweat and the sting of cheap perfume. Capone sat opposite them, a man with a smile that housed too many teeth. He gestured with the talent of a man who could make punishments sound like options. "You brought the seed," he said, and the room hummed with the soft, predatory interest of men who were always calculating the next move. Reyna's jaw tightened. Tomas felt an urge to pull away, but when he saw her hand that had earlier smoothed the hair from a refugee child's brow, he understood that the bargain was also a kind of claim she was making for herself. She placed a hand on his knee, a small tether, and he breathed as if she had given him air. "You have stepped beyond the tilling of soil now," he thought. "There is no going back to rows that need only weather and time. The earth would wait, but the city would not." Capone's smirk widened. "We offer you a clean break," he said. "We take him, we trade him for that ledger's removal. We hand him over to the right hands, and your family's history will be simplified." Reyna's eyes were ice. "You will not have him." There was a beat of sound like the tightening of a wire. Tomas could feel the silence pressing in, heavy with the weight of choices not yet made. Then, casually and inevitably, the club's door opened, and a man staggered in, a courier with a note for Capone. He did not fall to the floor. The rain that followed his entrance was blood. The scene exploded into violence, men moving with knives and the odd clinical use of steel. Tomas's world narrowed to the flash of metal and the smell of copper. In the chaos, Reyna's shape elongated into the thing everyone whispered about: predator, protector, alpha. She moved like a woman who had been waiting to be allowed her hunger. Men went down hard, and in the middle of it all, Tomas felt a fierce, unnameable thing rise in him. Not the patient tiller of soil, but something raw and willing. He did not know yet whether it was courage or the terror of losing his mother, or some sudden allegiance called into being by the closeness of Reyna's hand. But he understood, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that the bargain he had accepted would demand him in ways he had not expected, not merely to be the body that bore an heir, but to become someone ready to stand when they pressed him. By the time the club settled into the low din of wounded men and whispered curses, it was clear the meeting had not gone as Capone had planned. The ledger had not been given. The demand had not been met. Reyna looked at Tomas, and in her gaze was both apology and fierce pride. "We do not have forever," she said softly, "but we have this next hour. Hold to me." He did. He found himself holding to her as if to a stake that would keep him from being swept away. For a fleeting, incandescent second between the pain and the fear, he recognized there was another kind of harvest here. One of raw, feral loyalty that grew in the places most cultivated morals feared to tread. They left the club in a hush that tasted like rain-washed iron. Capone's men had been taught a lesson. A message had been sent. But lessons in this city were seldom the end of anything. They were punctuation in a sentence that would later erupt into scandal or blood. As they stepped into the night, beyond the neon sputter, Tomas felt the ledger's weight as something that would not just be ink on paper, but a map of his soul. He had not yet decided whether the territory it drew would be a home or a prison. But he had, thinly and irrevocably, begun to answer Reyna's whispered demand. "Give me a child," she had said that first night. He was learning that the giving would not be simple, that the child would not be only an heir, but a fulcrum for change. He was learning, too, that Reyna's request was not merely for bloodlines, but for a chance to be unmade and remade by something tender and living. Behind them, the city roared, a thing that had been unwilling to let them both go without a fight. Ahead, the ledger waited, and the ink in its pages would be written by choices that would cost more than either of them had yet admitted they could pay. They walked into that future together, each step a question answered in the only way left, by movement. They found him at the well before dawn, pale and tied to a post, the skin around the rope rubbed raw and damp. The deputy's truck sat half hidden in the lane, two men in cheap suits lounging like they were expecting applause. Tomas had been stripped of the safehouse's small camouflage. No ledger, no Moretti seal, only the stink of old rain and the dry metallic tang of fear. He looked smaller than he had in the club, thinner in the face, his eyes ringed with an exhaustion that wasn't just from sleep. Reyna smelled of gun oil and blood before she saw the deputy. She moved like a blade unrolling, silent, cold, a predator who had been trained to find the wound before the body bled. The deputy lifted his hands as if the gesture could soften a bullet. "I thought I'd find him easy," he said, lips licking at the words like a man tasting money. "We can trade. Capone wants a show. Maybe we can make both families happy." "You forget your place," Reyna said, and there was no frost in it, only the kind of finality that made men recalibrate. Her men flowed around the deputy's truck like a current taking the shore. Vasco stood at her shoulder with a face that had smoothed into professionalism. He had the look of someone who had smelled betrayal and decided where it landed. He had been the one to bring Tomas to the safe house. Tomas's pulse stuttered at the sight of him. "Vasco," Tomas croaked. The wrist under the rope shivered where it could, a small animal trying to shrug off a snare. Vasco's jaw did a mechanical twitch. There was a place in his face where loyalty had once sat comfortably. Tonight it was a hard, unfamiliar map. "We moved him here because we were told to," Vasco said. "Orders come down the ledger, sometimes with dates you cannot ignore." "Orders from who?" Tomas demanded, and his voice was a brittle thing. The deputy smiled, a white, small thing. "From both sides, maybe. From men who like tidy errors. From men who prefer witnesses neat and paid for." Reina's hand landed on Tomas' shoulder like a claim. Her claws, literal when the moon had weight, were not bared, but there was an intensity in the press of her palm that suggested she could crush bone if she wished. "Who put you here?" she asked Vasco. The man did not answer at first. He did not look away, which was worse. "I did what I had to," he said finally. "Orders from above." Capone's men offered coin. Then the deputy came with threats, leverage on his family. The city squeezes. You sold him." The verdict left Tomas's mouth as a stone. The betrayal cut cleaner than any blade, because it was not an enemy hand that had tied him. It was the one that had taught him to hope. Vasco's face broke for the second it took a bird to blink. I thought I could protect him. I thought I'd be moving him to a different safe spot. The deputy lied. They set a trail only I could follow. By the time I realized it was a trap, the ledger had already moved." His voice thinned. "I am sorry." Reina's eyes went very small, wolf pupils in slate. She turned away as if to hide the small quake in her shoulders. Tomas felt something like ice climb his spine. Not only had the world forced a ledger on him, but the ledger had been written in a hand he had trusted. The city rearranged itself again, making strangers of allies. "Take him," the deputy said. "We can bargain. Or perhaps we take him for our own little show. The Morettis will have to decide whether keeping him costs them a life." They hauled him toward the truck like a sack of goods. Tomas kicked and cursed and bit the dirt with impotent fury. His hands tried to find the cord that bound him, to tear at it with the ineffectual strength of someone who had learned to coax life out of soil, not wrench it from ropes meant for animals. Reina lunged and cut the rope with a small knife, her movements a blur. For a second, hope lit his chest like a match. "You should have run," she snapped, hauling him behind her body, pulling him against the lane stone. Her teeth flashed. She had given him protection in ink. Now she was giving it with muscle. Men fell away like paper under her weight. They beat a retreat, and for a handful of breathless minutes, it looked as if they would take Tomas back to the safe house and close the ledger with fresh ink. But war does not care for neat endings. Capone's men had agents who smelled the taste of blood in the city's underbelly. The deputy called in a favor. Reinforcements thumped down the narrow lane like a small earthquake. They were flankers and brokers and men whose consciences had bank accounts. They moved with the cruelty of people who had long forgotten that names belonged to living things. In the scramble, a hand found Tomas' wrist, Vasco's, and his grip was not helpful but desperate. He forced something into Tomas' palm, a scrap of paper folded tiny. "If you ever want it to stop," Vasco hissed, "you have to understand who you told. You told someone in the warehouse the night of the hit. You saw a face. Tell who it was, and they'll unmake you." Tomas unfurled the paper later, after they'd been forced into a back alley, and the world narrowed to the sounds of men searching. The scrap had only one sentence scrawled in a hand he recognized, Reina's shorthand, lean and private. "You saw me." The truth landed with a sound like a shouted name. He had not known, not fully. He had seen hands, a silhouette, the flaring of a knife, the mask of a woman moving like a shadow. He had assumed Moretti's orders came from a room farther above, not from the body before him that had asked, in a moonlit breath, for a child. And now Vasco's betrayal and his paper confirmed the horrible arithmetic of the city. Tomas had not only been the witness to a crime, he had been a witness to the woman who had performed it. When Tomas looked at Reina, the man saw not only the predator who had saved him, but also the architect who had fashioned the act that had set this whole ledger in motion. The knowledge was a blade he held between both palms. "You were there," he said, the accusation thin as a wire. "You—" Reina's face shaped itself into 1,000 levels of refusal and confession. For a beat, she closed her eyes as if pain could be shut away like a book. "I was," she admitted. "I ordered it. I—" His mouth went dry. He thought of the neighbor with moonlit eyes, the one whose body he had stumbled upon and whose death had rotted his sleep. He had carried that corpse in secret like a stone. The stone now bore the imprint of the woman who had asked him to become a seed for her lineage. "You killed him," Tomas whispered. "I did not kill him for sport," Reina said quickly, the voice of a soldier who must explain strategy to a child. "He was a liability. He had sold goods to men who were breaking faith with the family. Her hands curled helpless. "I have ordered things no decent woman should have to say she did. I thought I was making us safe." Tomas's rage was not all moral. It was also private, intimate. The bargain she had made with him, the tender thing that had slipped through teeth and bone when she cradled refugee children and left him bread, those gestures now tasted of calculation. Had her tenderness been a curtain drawn to hide the ledger's teeth? Had the lullabies been a cover for the ledger's ink? The thought was a slow, corrosive poison. "You asked me for my life to seed your family," he said, "and behind that ask, you had blood on your hands that I didn't know about." Reina drew back as if struck. Her pupils shrank into angry coins. "I did what was necessary to keep my family alive," she said. "I will not pretend otherwise. But I did not come to you with the ledger to punish you. I came because I thought, because I hoped." "You hoped to use me?" Tomas cut in. The sound of it was a brittle hammer. "No," she flinched, and the denial came out too small. "I hoped to share something that wasn't ledgered. I wanted— God, Tomas!" The words broke like glass. "I wanted a thing that wasn't inventory. I wanted to be more than an order on a page." He had believed in the small acts, her hand on his knuckle, the loaf at the window. They had been real. They had also been entangled with the ledger, with the code that had taught her to measure love in strategic increments. That entanglement made them rotten at the core. In the alley, sirens began to wail, a thin, accusing chorus. Capone's men tightened the net, and the deputy laughed in a tone that suggested had already worked out every outcome. Vasco looked at his boots, and then at Reina, and then at Tomas, and the man's face finally became a map of failure. "I thought I could protect you," he said to Tomas. "I thought I could keep both hands clean." "You didn't keep anything clean," Tomas said. He had never felt so untethered from the soil he loved, as if the earth itself were refusing to hold him because the ledger had marked him beyond salvage. Reina stepped forward, taking the blame like armor. "You are not theirs to take," she said, turning her fury outward. "Not while I can breathe." But Tomas could not bear to be the object of her fight anymore, not when the weapon she used to defend him had been barbed with the same cruelty that had killed his neighbor. He stepped back as if distance could reset the ledger's lines. "I don't belong to you," he said, and in the simplest statement lay a fracture that split them open. She reached, but he did not take her hand. The moment the touch failed, the world shifted differently. Not lovers, not collaborators, but two figures bound by a bargain that had eroded trust into something dangerous and brittle. The deputy's laugh swelled, and Capone's men pressed like tide. When they took Tomas that night, it was not in caprice. It was in a civilized sort of cruelty. They walked him to the truck and shoved him inside, and for a while his hands beat on the metal as if the action could scaffold him back to something that felt like truth. Reina's voice was a small, raw thing through the open window. "I will find you," she promised. "I will undo what I have done." His reply was a whisper she could not hear over the engine's growl. "I don't know if I can be undone," he said to the night. Vasco looked away as they closed the truck's box. His face was a ledger in ruin. For the first time since he'd entered Moretti's service, he seemed less like a man who could be trusted and more like a man who had been broken into pieces and reassembled with lies. The truck pulled away and the rain began to fall, soft and indifferent, turning the alley into a smear of light and shadow. Reina remained in the lane, hands empty, her silhouette a small, furious statue against the city's indifferent sky. Her men fanned out, guns raised, but Capone's reach was long and patient. The deputy waved the truck on with a salute that tasted of victory. As Tomas's world blurred into the shapes of the city receding, he understood something fierce and terrible. The ledger had not just written him into a future, it had rewritten the past he had thought he knew. Reina was not only his protector and his caller to something tender, she was also the hand that had placed the neighbor's body in the alley that night. The realization sat in him like a stone. Inside the truck, with the city sliding by like an indifferent witness, Tomas pressed his forehead to the cool metal, and for the first time in days, he let himself hate without reservation. He hated the ledger. He hated the men who dealt in blood like currency. And in the center of that hatred, small and jagged, was Reina, the woman who had asked him for a child and then showed him the ledger's teeth. Her face, as she stood in the rain, was a foreign land he had once wanted to explore. Now it was the map that had led him into capture, and he didn't know whether it was treason to love a place that could betray him, or courage to leave it behind. The truck sped on into the city's dark, and the night swallowed the thin thread that had tied them together until the next act of the ledger demanded payment. Reina watched the truck disappear with a violence that felt like a personal wound. The rain bled down her face and mingled with the grit on her cheeks. For a long, shocked breath, she stood still, as if the city itself had shoved something vital from her chest. Then the ledger, inked, merciless, the very thing she'd once thought could buy meaning, burned in her hands like a brand. She had promised protection with her mouth. Now she would pay with the rest of her life. She moved with the economy of someone who had spent an existence learning how to take back what had been stolen. Orders snapped from her like whip cracks. Men who had been tentative a heartbeat before became a blade line. They ran through alleys and up tenements, asking favors in low voices, calling in debts that had been kept beneath rugs. Reina did not sleep or plan. She executed. Hours later, they found the truck where Capone's men stashed prisoners, a disused railway yard that smelled of rust and damp. Tomas was inside, hooded, his wrists chafed raw. The deputy was at the perimeter with a smug clarity that made Reina's teeth ache. Capone's lieutenants lounged, thinking the night's cruelty would be finished with a bottle of cheap whiskey. Reina stepped from the shadows like a sanction of storm. She did not bargain, she did not parley, she moved. In the sudden calculus of violence, she had always been the executioner. Tonight she shifted the role to rescuer and martyr. Men tried to flank, and they found themselves folded into the pavement by hands that knew every break and pressure point. Vasco fought at her side as if to make amends with muscle. The deputy's gun barked, someone screamed, Tomas's hood hit the floor. When Reina reached him, he saw the thing he had feared and desired all in one look, a woman who could and would dismantle the world for him. Her palm cupped his cheek with the gentleness of someone who had memorized pain. Her voice was a blade and a balm. "We leave," she said, "now." They did not leave quietly. Capone's men swarmed like hornets, and the yard blurred into a fight that tasted of iron. At the far edge of the melee, a car engine thundered, and men in suits, Capone's backup, moved to seal the exit. Reyna had planned for contingencies. She had not planned for the way her chest split when Tomas reached for her in the rush, his fingers finding the scar at her jaw like an invocation. "Run," she whispered, and for a half moment he did, following Vasco and a narrow rain-slick seam between crates. Then a shout drew him back. A flanking squad had cornered them, guns leveled. Capone's lieutenant had a thin, cruel smile and a rifle trained on Reyna. Reyna did the thing that would forever tilt the ledger's lines. She stepped forward into the rifle's iron, planted herself between Tomas and the barrel, and spoke a line that was more vow than order. "Take me," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were molten with an adoration that made the world lurch. "Take me instead." Time fractured. Tomas lunged, instinct first, love second, but Vasco held him like a vice. Men argued, a shot cracked the air and tore through the night. Reyna took the blow. The blood gushed like a confession. She did not fall immediately. She steadied herself on 2 feet as if the wound were another thing she could bear. Tomas broke free and crumpled to her side. His hands were frantic, learning how to press a wound shut with palms that had known only soil. "No," he screamed, the words swallowing the yard. "You promised." "I promised you life," Reyna rasped, blood pooling at her lips. And the humor of it made him sob. "I promised a future. You still have a choice." He pressed his face to her chest and heard the faint, ragged map of her heartbeat. She had given herself. The ledger had demanded, and then gone beyond its pages. An act of defiance that would ripple outward and cost her everything. Capone's men, for once, had not expected such uncomfortably human currency. When the city took them away in a blur of sirens and shouts, Reyna was hauled off, a body with Moretti tattoos and a wound that would be told in whispers. Tomas rode in the ambulance like a man who had been baptized in blood. He had watched her, choose him over the mantle, watched an Alpha fracture the family code with a sacrament of her own flesh. That night, as the surgery lamp stitched Reyna together, Tomas sat on a hard plastic chair and counted breaths. He had nothing to offer the ledger anymore. His name could be crossed and rewritten, his mother moved and hidden, but nothing would erase what he had seen. He had watched a woman make herself a shield. He had seen tenderness wrapped in the brutality of the world he had always feared. When the surgeon finally closed the door and whispered that she would live, but the scars would not be small, Tomas slid into the sterile room and took her hand. Her fingers were cool, the wound a map he traced with the reverence of a man learning to read a new language. She opened her eyes and found his face the first thing in the light. Her laugh was a broken thing. "I asked for a child," she whispered, and the sentence hung like a bell. He searched her face for the ledger's ink and found only the honest ruin of a woman who had chosen love as a battlement. He curled his fingers into hers and, without ceremony, answered in the only way the city had allowed 2 ruined people to be tender. "Then we'll grow one in soil, not fear," he said. "We'll plant it if you'll let me tend." She smiled, and the gesture was both fragile treaty and stubborn defiance. Around them, the city churned. Capone would complain, the deputy would bray, the ledger would thrum with new entries. But in that small hospital room, Reynana's sacrifice had rewritten the first line of what might become a different future. It would cost her power, perhaps even status. It might cost them both more than they could imagine. Yet she had given what the ledger had never taught her to value: the terrible, uncompromised willingness to risk herself for someone not born of family strategy, but of human claim. Outside, the rain finally slowed, and the moon, when it found the clouds, painted the scar on her cheek like a stripe of light. They kept her in the hospital 3 days longer than necessary, under the thin pretense of stitches and antibiotics and the city's tendency to make saints of the weak for as long as it suited them. In truth, Reyna's ward book read like a secret ledger.
Men came and went with careful faces, bringing sealed messages, soft-spoken threats, and offerings of truth. Tomas slept in a chair that folded his spine into complaints and dreams. He learned the cadence of nurses' footsteps and the shape of Reina's breath against the inside of his wrist. When she finally stood, stiff, bandaged, bowed but breathing with a stubborn belligerence, there was a new economy to the world around them. Capone sent a low-priority emissary who coughed out a perfunctory apology that smelled of concessions. The deputy was quietly reassigned to a precinct far from the harbor. Vasco, who had broken and tried to rebuild himself in the same motion, came to Tomas with a face that had been cleansed of excuses by guilt. He offered them what the city calls peace, a line drawn in dirt that the major families nodded to because it was easier to sign than to continue burning money and men. None of it made the ledger vanish. The Moretti name still had teeth, and Reina still had debts etched into the bones of her alliances. But her choice at the rail yard, sacrificing power for a man no ledger had made valuable, twisted something in the family's calculus. Old men who had counted heirs as currency felt the heat of public surprise when the enforcer who had been the family's iron stepped down from a throne made of fear and declared a new valuation, a life. The Morettis grumbled, adjusted, and in the quiet that followed, they carved out a narrow place for what Reina wanted. They brokered a fragile truce. Capone's men were paid with favors, not blood. The deputy's ledger was scrubbed with a series of transactions that left everyone slightly poorer and the city slightly more illustrated in its contradictions. Reina relinquished a sliver of authority, an act that would be dissected by her lieutenants for years. And in return, she gained custody of a modest, stubborn future, a small farmhouse on the outskirts, under the same indifferent moon, where Tomas could plant rows again without fear the soil would be used against them. The first morning they moved, the city exhaled in a way that tasted of rain and old coal. Reina labored with bandaged hands like a woman learning tenderness all over. Tomas taught her how to turn soil so that seeds did not rot, how to listen to rain like the most honest counsel. They argued over fences and over names. She wanted to christen a child in the ledger's language. He wanted names that smelled of his mother's kitchen and the slow work of seasons. They found a middle, a name that sounded like both a promise and a protest. Their days shaped themselves into a new rhythm. Danger still hummed at the city's edges, but it no longer occupied the center of their lives. Reina answered to fewer calls. She refused to be only the instrument of Moretti will. Tomas learned how a woman could be both storm and hearth, and how a man could make a choice that altered the cost of that storm. Where once the moon had marked them with fear, it now mapped a memory. The night she asked for a child, and later, the night she took a bullet for him. Both truths sat on her skin like silver. One evening, after the planting and the arguments and the mending of fences and the scolding of a stray dog, they walked the turn road together under a sky thick with stars. The moon was a perfect coin, the scar at Reina's jaw catching its light and looking, for all the world, like an old map. Tomas stopped and took her face in both his hands, the same small, calloused palms that had once only coaxed beans from stubborn beds. He kissed the stripe of lit metal where bone and history met, and she closed her eyes with the ease of someone finally permitted to rest. "We will teach it to be kind," he murmured, half promise, half prayer. She smiled, the mouth of the Alpha that had learned a softer language. "We will teach it where to hide and where to plant roots," she said. "We will teach it how to choose." They stood together then, two people who had been traded, betrayed, and rebuilt, coaxing seedlings into the earth that had once seemed too small to hold the weight of their secret. Above them the moon watched, impartial and patient, and the scar on her cheek shone like a lighthouse for anyone who needed a beacon. Beautiful, dangerous, and unmistakably human.